Thank you for tuning into this presentation. I'm Laura Henderson, and I'm presenting our research on the regulation of video games. Specifically, we're focusing on loot boxes, a potentially harmful gambling-like randomized monetization method found in video games, which no doubt most of you are already familiar with. So what exactly is a loot box? Although most of you will have some idea of this already, I'll start by setting out the way that we define loot boxes for the purpose of our research. Loot boxes are virtual consumable items in video games that can be opened by players to obtain randomized rewards of varying in-game and real-world value. They come in many different forms, such as treasure chests, card packs, prize wheels, gacha machines, and they appear in a lot of popular games such as Genshin Impact. Our research focuses on paid loot boxes that can be bought for real-world money. These appear to be the most harmful as they directly cause overspending of real-world money by players. Some games allow loot box rewards to be traded between players, which can allow players to sell in-game items for real-world money. This means that these loot box rewards gain real-world monetary value. So what can loot box rewards do? Some rewards are purely cosmetic. For example, they may make your weapon glow pink instead of blue, or give you gold rather than silver armor. Other rewards actually influence the gameplay. These could unlock additional content or give the player a competitive advantage over other players, such as more powerful weapons. How much do people spend on loot boxes? We don't have conclusive data on worldwide loot box spending because this data is held by game companies and they don't release their loot box sales data to the public. In China, however, video game companies are legally required to publicly disclose the results of all loot box openings. This has led to loot box purchasing history becoming available as public data for some games. We've been able to figure out that just one game, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, or CSGO, generates well over 700,000 Australian dollars per day in China alone. So worldwide spending on loot boxes is clearly substantial. So what are the potential harms of loot boxes? Firstly, they're structurally similar to gambling. Both loot boxes and traditional gambling involve the player or gambler paying an amount of money with the hope of obtaining something more valuable or more money through a randomized process. Empirical evidence has consistently established that there is a relationship between loot box spending and problem gambling. Specifically, that the more severe participants' problem gambling was, the more money they spent on loot boxes. Although I will add that we don't know yet whether loot boxes cause people to become problem gamblers, or if people are already problem gamblers are more likely to spend a lot of money on loot boxes. Loot boxes are now a common sight across all major video game platforms. Many researchers are particularly concerned about children and other vulnerable groups being exposed to loot boxes. The UK Gambling Commission has found that 23% of UK 11 to 16-year-olds have paid real money for loot boxes. Previous research on loot box prevalence in the UK found that 59% of the 100 highest grossing iPhone games contained loot boxes, and almost the same percentage of these games, which are specifically deemed suitable for children, also contain loot boxes. Prompted by backlash from player communities, as well as perhaps ethical, legal, or public relations concerns, some video game companies have stopped implementing loot boxes in their games. So we considered whether the bad reputation of loot boxes among player communities may have caused the loot box prevalence rate in 2021 to be lower than the rate from 2019, given that there have been media reports of some companies no longer implementing these mechanics. Different policy approaches have been taken in different countries. For example, in Belgium, all implementations of paid loot boxes are gambling, so a ban without gambling license, none of which the video game companies have. In contrast, more paid loot boxes in the UK and Australia are not legally recognised as gambling, so they remain unregulated. We're expecting a white paper setting out the UK government's regulatory plans, if any, on this issue in the coming months. And here in Australia, Mr. Andrew Wilkie, the MP for Clark in Tasmania, said that he was going to propose a bill that would ban the sale of loot boxes to under 18s back in July 2021, but nothing has come of this yet. He said that he was going to do it around August, September 2021, but his officers said to my co-author Xiao personally that he's still planning on proposing the bill, and perhaps something will still come out of this at some point. So how can loot boxes be regulated? There are several potential ways to do this, and restricting players from purchasing loot boxes, in other words, an outright ban, is only one of many different potential approaches. Another less restrictive approach that retains players' autonomy to purchase loot boxes and preserves video game companies' existing commercial interests has been adopted as law in China. This law requires companies to disclose the exact probabilities of obtaining potential rewards from their loot boxes. This measure is arguably borrowed from the gambling harm reduction literature, but what does this measure mean in practice for video games? So here we have two examples of probability disclosures taken from video game screenshots. On the left, we can see that if we bought this loot box, we would have a 4.61% chance of obtaining an elite tier hero, the rarest category of reward available. On the right, we can see probabilities disclosed for specific items rather than just for categories. For example, a player has a 1% chance of obtaining Mario in his happy outfit. So why are probability disclosures helpful? They mean that players have a better idea of how many loot boxes they might need to buy before they decide to spend their money, and it also illustrates just how low their chances are of getting the reward they're looking for. This is where the title of our paper comes in: what are the odds? As I mentioned, China is currently the only country to require loot box probability disclosures by law. Worldwide, however, video game companies have adopted this measure as a form of industry self-regulation. For example, Apple and Google require probability disclosures for all games on their respective app stores. The law generally has greater enforcement power in the sense that non-compliant companies could be fined. In contrast, industry self-regulation is generally voluntary. Non-compliant companies face no negative consequences. This raises the question, is legal regulation more effective than industry self-regulation? If industry self-regulation is just as effective, then there is no need for other countries to introduce laws such as the one that's been adopted in China. But if industry self-regulation is less effective, then other countries should also consider adopting this measure as a law in order to improve the compliance rate in the interest of consumer protection. With these questions in mind, we assess loot box prevalence and compliance rate with industry self-regulation for the 100 highest grossing iPhone games in the UK, and compared our results with Zendel's 2019 UK findings and our own previous 2020 Chinese findings. In 2019, the UK prevalence rate was observed at 59%. We hypothesized that because some companies have decided to stop implementing loot boxes, the prevalence rate would now be statistically significantly lower. However, we actually found loot boxes to be present in 77% of the 100 highest grossing iPhone games. This was statistically significantly higher than the 59% found 2 years ago. This suggests that at least on the mobile games market, the loot box prevalent rates has not decreased and has actually increased. Children and adults alike are now more likely to be exposed to loot boxes than they were in 2019. Now, if you attended last year's DiGRA Australia conference, you might remember that when we assessed the loot box probability disclosure rate of the 100 highest grossing iPhone games from mainland China in 2020, we found that 95.6% of games containing loot boxes disclosed probabilities. However, the disclosure rate that we found in the UK was only 64%. This was statistically significantly lower than the Chinese compliance rate. This means that, at least in the loot box probability disclosure context, voluntary self-regulation is less effective than the law at ensuring compliance. In countries where industry self-regulation has already been adopted, such as the UK, probability disclosures should still be required by law to increase the compliance rate and actually provide the level of consumer protection that has been promised to video game players. This means that, at least in the loot box probability disclosure context, voluntary self-regulation is less effective than the law at ensuring compliance. In countries where industry self-regulation has already been adopted, such as the UK, probability disclosures should still be required by law to increase the compliance rate and actually provide the level of consumer protection that has been promised to video game players. This doesn't mean that industry self-regulation is completely useless. In fact, there are many potential benefits. An industry regulator is much better able to understand technical aspects of video game design and respond more quickly and more cost-effectively to new industry developments and to any instances of non-compliance, whereas the law is often incredibly slow in adapting to novel issues. What the industry self-regulation we've looked at so far is missing is enforcement powers. Apple and Google don't appear to punish companies for breaking their self-regulations by not making probability disclosures. But it's possible for industry self-regulation to get stricter. Through contractual terms, self-regulators such as app stores could impose and enforce private law punishments. App stores can delist non-compliant games, disable in-app purchase features, and even freeze funds and delay the transfer of revenue generated by the game's previous month's sales. In the face of such threats, video game companies would be far more likely to do what they promised to do and disclose probabilities to their players. We can look at the example of South Korea's industry self-regulation. This has better enforcement powers than the Apple and Google app stores and reported a compliance rate of 90.8% in August 2021, much higher than the 64% found in the UK and closer to the 95.6% disclosure rate found under the Chinese law. Thank you for listening. I'll take questions now, but if you have any further questions after the Q&A session, Please get in touch with us using any of these methods.